food that she was getting at the distribution site was going to these children because she was looking after them once again. And that is her role and responsibility. That is her, it has to do with cultural norms, and there was also a catastrophic shock that she was responding to in addition to the flood. And then finally, the third woman that I spoke with was probably in her 20s. She had a child, a young child, who was, I guess, 18 months old. And she was displaced because of the flood, but she'd been actually displaced before that because her husband's family decided that she should not be married to her husband because they were of the wrong ethnic background. So she had the child. She was not able to find a husband because several attempts had not worked out, and therefore she was landless, she was homeless, and the flood just made it worse. So she was actually happy. I think all three women had these vulnerabilities, but they were much more long-term. And the flood was just overlaying on these very gendered vulnerabilities that they had. And so the response, you know, in terms of addressing the flood situation, that is kind of an overlay because deep underneath that, there are vulnerabilities that these women were living with that had everything to do with their gender and their age to some extent. So it became very clear to me that if we really want to address these issues, if we really want to build resilience, we need to be looking at these cultural constructs and these issues that exist with actual women within society, looking at their vulnerability through that lens. Interestingly, we're doing some research right now. We have done some research with Tango International in Bangladesh. A couple of years ago, there was some research done that compared well-being outcomes before and after catastrophic floods. And it was found that in communities where there was work on empowering women, that resilience increased, that there were more well-being outcomes in those areas and that they were more resilient than in others. And more recently, we're repeating some more in-depth studies with Tango in Bangladesh, where we're looking at characteristics of people and how that impacts their resilience in the context of a program. And in fact, some of the lessons from that are things that are practical and we can apply. So for instance, we're finding out that younger pregnant and lactating women are least resilient in terms of are looking at the types of activities that we're doing. So maybe we're not addressing their vulnerabilities to the extent that we can. So we're looking at that as, you know, how can we do a better job? Yeah, I know. I need to pass this on. I could go on all day, but I wanted to provide some examples. I hope that makes sense, and I'll pass that on to Dorcas.
Thanks, Mara. And this is my version of the framework of my printer that's running out of
color.
Color ink. I just want to start by asking you to raise your hand if you are primarily identified as a gender specialist. Okay, and if you primarily identify as a resilience specialist. Okay, and a gender and resilience specialist? Okay, I just sort of wanted to get, because as you said, Christy, I'm a co-director for the Resilience Measurement Evidence and Learning Community of Practice, but I'm also consulting freelance. And I'm particularly intrigued around what's making it challenging for organizations to make the link. Many of you are in organizations that have a gender policy standard framework and have a resilience strategy standards or framework, but they're not coming together. And a couple of years ago, the Community of Practice commissioned a piece of work, which is a review of 45 frameworks. If you go through this on a word search with the word gender, Oxfam is the gender. So that's just something to kind of mull over. But building off what you were saying, Mara, I think what's really exciting right now for practice is that we've seen gender equity and women's voice come forward and be very structured in quite particular ways around policies and strategies and standards in organizations. And in the same period, and I'm looking over the last 5 years or so, we've seen resilience go from being technical approaches like disaster risk reduction or climate change adaptation to be a way of thinking about challenges and change in the world and how they impact on people, individuals, households, communities, and higher level systems. As Laurie alluded to, what that's helping with, I know you can't all see this, is break out underneath those 3 types of capacities, which is becoming a kind of common way of thinking about resilience. You know, what capacities do people need and households need and things need to absorb, adapt to, and transform systems in the face of complex shocks and stresses over time. And as this is being broken out more, we're beginning to see much more scope in here to say, well, how do different individuals, what capacities do they already have, and how are those mediated through gender and the sort of the framing of the gender domain? What capacities need to be strengthened to support individuals and households and communities in the face of the kinds of shocks and stresses they're dealing with, including those idiosyncratic shocks and stresses that shape underlying vulnerabilities? So we're starting to see a significant opportunity here to sort of tease out what types of capacities, for whom, in what circumstances, and how best can we provide the interventions that build those capacities over time for those different groups. So I think a lot of, I mean, I'm just thinking about my experience. I was in care for a long time. A lot of our traditional disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation initiatives have done good work in terms of we need, for example, in decision-making and participatory planning processes, we need to make sure that women and men are involved in those processes. But we're not really in the place a couple of years ago to say, well, are there some individual capacities to do with people's gender or how we deliver those interventions that we need to be teasing out? I think this framework, by visually bringing those 2 pieces together, is providing a window for these 2 communities that Laurie alluded to, the resilience practitioner and the gender practitioner, to really sort of start to tease out what is the layering here, the sequencing of the kinds of interventions that we need to bring to bear to enable people of different genders to really be more resilient in the face of shocks and stresses.
So can you guys talk a little bit about, now that the framework has been developed, it's been visualized, I think it's well presented. Can you talk a little bit about how that, early on, I know, enabled you to articulate some of this theory a little bit more kind of in your work or in your agencies or outside maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. A big piece of this for me when we were pulling together the framework is that gender interacts with resilience not just around individual vulnerabilities. And that's a big piece of it. I think we have a lot of data out there around women and girls and vulnerabilities in natural disasters and also in conflict. And that's a very core piece of our work and our considerations and assessments. But in pulling together this framework, we really wanted to focus on how gender domains impact not just individuals, but also affect households, communities, and systems. For example, there can be gendered bank policies at institutional levels that can impact access to certain resources that women could use in the face of a shock or stress. And then also, in many cases, women have unique gendered capacities that, such as social capital, we'll often see in many areas that women actually have stronger social capital than men do in some communities, and they can rely upon that in the face of a shock or stress in a way that men and boys cannot often. You also see there's been some great research, not sure if anyone in the room who worked on it, but around men's vulnerabilities in the face of natural disasters, how their roles of often they aren't able to evacuate, or they're the last ones to evacuate, and that places them in unique positions of vulnerabilities. And then also looking at the recovery and the response trajectories here, what actually happens, and how gender domains can impact that
response as well. And that's why decision-making comes out so strongly when we're talking about gender and resilience. And the program that I manage at Mercy Corps Bridge, we've worked with 6 different resilience focused programs to apply a gender lens and uncover key gaps that we're missing and then develop tools to address them. And decision-making has been one that came out quite strongly because you may have access to certain assets, but if you don't have the decision-making power to use them to prepare for or respond to a shock or a disaster, then they are not capacity, right? You can't actually use them even though they're available. And so this is a piece that came out very strongly in some work that the Bridge program did with a program called LEAP. We're focused on mobile financial services in Niger. And although women actually were more likely to save money, they had very little financial decision-making power in the household. And so our teams in Niger developed an approach called the Household Dialogue, where they facilitated dialogue within households to start to and uncover the assets that women have and that they actually brought to the table to benefit the entire household and community. And that's where the resilience piece is very interesting, is that it's not just about what's happening at this individual level, but about how all these levels are connected, how what's happening at the individual and household level can then impact community and society as well. Thank you, Audrey.
So one last question, and then we'll open up to just a few from the group before we wait for the small group. I wondered if you guys could talk a little bit about how you see this framework being applied in actual programming, sort of your sense and thinking of that, what would that look like?
Well, it's interesting because recently I was involved in a design process in one of our country offices, and I just kind of threw it out there to folks, and they said, well, we should introduce this in our communities as part of an adaptation process, community-based adaptation process, and see what happens with it. And I thought, well, that's cool, that it's not our framework, but that it could be something that can guide people in terms of their understanding of their vulnerabilities and potential capacities to improve resilience for all members and capacities for all members of their community. So seeing the big picture rather than, there are just these generic households and what do we do to make their lives better. So looking at the specific needs.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I'm interested in, and some of the members of the community of practice, is, clearly using your gender tools and analysis tools to help you understand the gender differences in terms of vulnerabilities, capacities, and applying that to thinking about the building blocks and the different interventions for different people is critical. But there's another piece in here, which is the gender community talking about gender transformative approaches, and the resilience community talking about transformative capacities. And both of them have a common understanding, which is that we need systems to be changing and evolving to promote equality and effectively resilience for all, if you like. We need to be much more nuanced in terms of making sure we're getting resources to the right places to benefit all people. And I think that's an area that some agencies are beginning to think about a bit more robustly. I don't know if any of you follow Gender and Development, the journal that Oxfam edits. They did a special issue on gender and resilience in 2015, and I take a look at that. And one of the things they're advocating is that we see resilience programming as an opportunity to move gender equality and women's empowerment. And I think that's something that is coming forward much more. It's coming into the measurement community a bit more. There's some examples here of projects that are looking more closely at how resilience interventions are affecting transformative capacities. And what we tend to see is that absorptive capacities are somewhat better addressed and more apparent in measurement and evaluation, and sort of it gets a bit weaker the further we go through. But there's a huge opportunity to explore the synergies around the concept of transformation.
And I just want to add one point to cap that off, is quite often we see in gender-focused programs that they are addressing some of these capacities that we think of as adaptive capacities for, in resilience. but in fact they're already being addressed, but they're not being seen through a resilience lens.
Great. So let's take a couple questions from the group. Big picture questions about the framework, and then we'll split here. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Schleck from SB 2020, and so having worked on health and specifically reproductive health and preparedness efforts and also in resilience, I'm curious what your thoughts are as far as where health fits in the current design of the framework. Clearly, gender is a social construct, but there are clear physical issues that are faced, and so, it certainly is a key component of resilience. It's, acknowledged, but where does it fit in this, or is this a separate community? And one thought is, I think, in addition to there being divides between resilience and gender, there are also divides between gender and health. And is this not, as we look at building resilience, a great opportunity to bring some of these communities together by aligning our language? Just a broad thought there.
Absolutely. I'll jump in and then let you guys add anything that might affect that. I think the way that we're thinking about gender resilience is not, or trying at least, not to be a separate gender as a sector, resilience as a sector. Both of them are really approaches to our work. And so you might have a program that's looking particularly at health or education, for example, or financial services or market development. And in order to actually achieve, and health can be treated in several different ways in this framework, same as gender-based violence. There's a number of issues that essentially fall into different categories, and we try to stay away from categorizing them and saying, GBV is this, health is this, but health can be treated as a well-being outcome. We have programs that are aiming to strengthen overall community health, public health, and in order to actually achieve these goals, we need to layer approaches of gender resilience on that. So our goal with the framework is to provide guidance for how can we actually achieve these outcomes that we seek within health, education, and other sectors by essentially strengthening resilience to these shocks that might threaten the person's health. And then that will only be effective if we're also considering the approach of gender as well. We can't actually strengthen resilience without considering the way that gender intersects with these different domains. But then there's also variations in health within person's capacities as well. I mean, and vulnerabilities. I think that it definitely touches on a number of different aspects of the framework as well. The inherent differences, gender differences, can certainly affect a person's capacity to respond as well.
And I gotta be honest. Yeah, there is a framework, or there are efforts to develop frameworks, I think, around health and resilience, particularly in the one of them that's extremely well developed right now is the what is it called? The GCAN, the Gender, Climate, and Nutrition Framework that was developed by IPRI. And so that's one that really specifically focuses on, nutrition aspects in a multi-sectoral way. This one is not meant to focus on sectors necessarily, but one thing that we're keenly interested in is the applicability in different sectors. So obviously, if you think that something, that this is the value for, the health sector, then definitely, or if you feel that there ought to be something else in place in order for it to be of value, then we're interested. But we do want to make sure that it's broadly applicable. Thanks.
Yes. Hi, Liz, I'm from Global Communities. So I was looking at this, and you mentioned social capital, Audrey, and is that captured by relations? Is that what that means? I was kind of thinking that. Okay, I wasn't sure because your example, Mara, of the woman who is sort of shunned by her husband's family, that to me sounded like an issue of social capital. She didn't have anyone else to fall back on, right, to help her through that time.
Well, she had people to fall back on, but she didn't have access to land or a solid home.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then my other quick question is, how would you have designed that flood intervention differently, maybe, if you had taken into consideration these different gendered issues of the three women that you had mentioned? I mean, I think it sounds like each one of them had their own contextual issues, that sure, it was part of their gender, but it was also part of a whole bunch of other things that happened to them before the flood. So how would you maybe design a flood intervention taking those into consideration?
Well, it's go about it probably would be to take into consideration all of the different social norms and issues that, existed within this community, and these were just 3. And get a broad picture of what were the key vulnerabilities that people were coping with that were perhaps more longer term underlying this flood that, that brought these things out to the fore. And taking those into consideration, perhaps looking at what longer term interventions were really needed in order to enable people to be more adaptive to this situation. That is addressing the underlying issues, gender issues that existed.
I feel like that's the heart of it, isn't it?
Right.
Like that it's not about how you would design the flood response
Right.
differently. It's how you would design a longer-term resilience-focused programming that looks at those root
Right.
causes and then looks at, in a shock or stressor like a flood, how that can be complementary to deeper causes. I mean, part of this is about shifting away from our traditional development programming here, emergency response,
Right.
track and dump here. It's about looking at how those underlying causes then complement that emergency response.
I mean, everybody, all 3 of those women really appreciated getting the food,
Sure.
but that was not going to solve their problem.
Right. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. You had a question? I know you're ready. Go ahead.
I'm Erin Antrobee. I work for Mundo. So speaking of underlying causes, Promoter focuses on engaging men and boys specifically in gender equality. Do you have any examples of engaging men and boys and thinking about gender transformative approaches, or is that more specifically through preventive measures, having kind of conversations with men and boys about harmful gender norms and attitudes and behaviors, or is that something separate to the response kind of effort?
I'll just come back on that quickly. Actually, I'm speaking on behalf of CAB. I worked with CAB's climate team for a number of years, until about a year ago. We did some work in 2015. CAB Australia funded a piece of research to look at climate change and DRR projects and how those had impacted gender equality. And when the consultant, she sort of wrapped up the research, but she came to me to get some insights on it. I said, why don't we review this through the lens of CAB's gender standards, which include talking through the kinds of approaches that are critical to promoting gender equality and engaging men and boys being one of those. So there is documentation online which is talking about how some of those projects had applied specific strategies around engaging men and boys in different ways. And I think there's a lot of opportunity to take that work further forward. And I think looking at this framework right now, there are a number of organizations, some in this room, who have a keen interest on, doing what Myra alluded to. Let's look at some of the gender programming that you're doing and actually think about that through a resilience lens. And we probably have things we can learn from now if we look at it through that lens. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to wrap questions, if you don't mind, because we're going to have some time to come back to it. I want to keep on schedule. You all have Post-it notes in front of you, and so the next activity that we're going to do is a little bit of kind of individual feedback. We want to be inclusive to working styles as well. So everyone has pink, yellow, and orange, which I just took all of yours. So on pink Post-it notes, you are going to write some comments about what you like about the framework. So think about what you like about the framework, what resonates to you, for you, what is really what's working here. And then these are going to go over here. On your orange Post-its, and you can do as many as you want, but we would ask one idea per Post-it. Think about what you would change or improve with the framework, or what questions are still remaining for you, because it's related to improving it. Like these questions would need to be answered because you still have questions. And those are going to go on orange, and then they will come over on this flip chart here. And we may have time to come back to some of the questions. So some of you who didn't get to post questions, if you could note those questions here as well. And then on the yellow would be something about how you might use this framework. Like, can you see opportunities for you to apply it? What are some ways that you might use it? And those are going to go over on this flip chart here. So I'm going to ask you guys to take a couple minutes and think on your own, make some notes, and then we are going to, did I get that right? I did get that right. Yeah. Okay. I was like, okay.
As long as it ends up on the same sheet.
Yeah. And then we're going to take a coffee break. And so we will come back afterwards and work with some of those. The coffee is set up, coffee and snacks are set up in the bar here. It's a great opportunity to mingle and chat with people. And we're going to come back at about 20-25 after. So take a few minutes and think about that. And then as you get them, go ahead and populate the flip charts, mingle, have some coffee, and chat. Thank you very much to our panel here, too. I appreciate you guys.
So we do have lunch available for everyone. It's out in the hall. We encourage you to grab some lunch and continue your conversation. Now that I've just broken them up, but we, obviously there's pilot projects to talk about or other ideas to consider. So please grab lunch and consider carrying that conversation forward. I would also encourage you, if you're not on the listserv, just in the back where you signed up, make sure that you signed and checked the box that says, yes, I would like to be on the listserv, and we will make sure you get on the listserv. The next meeting is Monday, and there is remote participation available for those of us who are not present in DC, but of course, you're always welcome to join. I also want to give you just a brief little reminder that today is the day to vote here in DC. So if you haven't had a chance to vote, go ahead and run on out. You're welcome. I think one thing that really stood out for me here today is the fact that there are people who started with this group and got busy with their jobs and have returned back. But the point is that there's real value in people sharing ideas and moving this work forward. So although there's a group that has been at the heart and been here at the beginning, people can't do it alone, and the infusion of new ideas has really helped to just move this work forward. So we really appreciate you being here today. I want to thank a few people. First of all, I want to thank our moderator for the panel, had to sneak out, Christy Gutman. I want to say thanks to her. Thanks to all our facilitators at the table. Thanks to our panelists. Again, I want to thank Mara and I want to thank Audrey for their incredible work over the past 2 years, 3 years. I can't even remember where we're at now. But really, we wouldn't be here without that pushing forward. Also wanted to thank, we had remote participation from Lori Starr, and we also had some great support with helping to pull together the event from Angelica Ospina, who's a member of the group as well. So she's not here, but she really was part of this and contributed to the work that's been done today. I also want to thank our colleagues on top, Karen Fox and Laura Zilmer, and Adrienne Ramos, who I just met today, and Adrienne Todello, which I don't think she's stepped out. She stepped out. Rachel, thank you so much for all of your contributions today and in prep for this. And with that, I will go ahead and close and enjoy lunch. Thank you for coming. And if you're ready to turn this, please turn this in. Please turn in one of your phones before you leave.
The leader has disconnected. The conference will be terminated in 5 minutes.